I'm meteorologist Peter Chan from the National Weather Service coming to you on this September 7th, 2022. And this is the Alaska Weather Show. Thank you for joining us. We do this each evening through a unique partnership with Alaska Public Media. There's a lot going on. Let's first quick check weather.gov. That is the National Weather Service's primary online presence, a point and click map that you can go to of the continental U.S. with Alaska and Hawaii to the lower left. Look at the western U.S., all the color there, pinks and shades of magenta and orange. We have excessive heat continuing out across much of California, southern Nevada. In fact, yesterday Sacramento hit a high temperature of 116 degrees. That's the air temperature. And just excessive heat continues there in the west, then across the northern Rockies, Pacific Northwest, even into the western high plains. The pink areas indicate, or I should say magenta areas indicate, red flag warnings for critical fire conditions where we take into account low humidity, warmer, hot temperatures combined with wind and the threat of dry lightning from thunderstorms. So not good news out there in the western states. And as far as here in Alaska, we have an active pattern here. Southern parts of the state, an early fall storm. It's got a windy frontal system with it that's going to push eastward across the western Gulf, south central areas, and the northern Gulf. It's accompanied by an atmospheric river that's going to produce heavy rainfall. As a result, flood watches have been issued to include areas of the northern Gulf and around Valdez and Cordova, inland through the Copper River Basin and back through the Mat-Su River valleys. Quite a bit of rain could fall. Highlight more of that coming up. But high wind warning has been issued for the central Alaska range, where winds could gust as high as 70 miles an hour through some of the passes like Windy and Isabel passes. And then we got word too today, Bear Glacier down there near Seward, the dammed lake is releasing into Resurrection Bay, and there could be some chunks of ice accompanying that water release that could impact boaters in Resurrection Bay. So watch out for some chunks of ice potentially being brought into the bay from the release of that glacier dammed lake. Looking at a couple of the FAA webcams, we can see Summit there up toward the central Alaska range. A high wind warning is in effect from early Thursday morning through Friday afternoon. 45 degrees there this afternoon. Winds will be picking up later tonight and especially on Thursday. Valdez, a flood watch is in effect for heavy rain. Valdez itself could see rainfall totals around 5 to 7 inches, locally higher in the higher terrain, the coastal mountains there, and especially eastward toward Cordova, where as much as 10 inches of rain could fall in some of the coastal mountains. Here's the hazardous weather map showing advisories, watches, and warnings. First of all, the flood watches that are in effect that include places like around the Mat-Su Valley, Willow, on up through Talkeetna, east toward Glen Ellen, and then south through Valdez and Cordova. Some of the heaviest rainfall will be in the coastal mountains there surrounding Valdez and Cordova. But again, with all the recreators out there doing any hunting and fishing, you'll want to stay tuned to the latest forecast and be very observant of your conditions if you're going to be out, because with that heavy rainfall, a number of these rivers and creeks could see some rapid rises here over the next couple of days and effectively cut off some low water crossings. Let's take a look at that. This is a shot I had on Monday when I went out to the Kenai River. High water there. We had a glacier dam release there from the Snow River from the glacier above that area. And it peaked out yesterday afternoon at around 13.8 feet into minor flood stage. It has since come down and will continue to do so just in time for this next batch of rain to arrive. So the Kenai is going to stay high in the coming days and may actually go back up after this next batch of rain moves through here during the course. Watch for river rises there this weekend. And one other final note, Southeast Alaska weather zone realignment that's coming up September 13th. This only affects forecast products, public and fire forecast products from the Juneau Forecast Office. Nothing to do with the marine zones there. Uses borough and census boundaries to help eliminate overwarning of the National Weather Service alerts across Southeast Alaska. If you have any other questions or concerns, you can contact juno.weather@noaa.gov. And on the satellite imagery, let's look at that plume of moisture riding up there with that strong southwesterly jet stream aloft up to 150 knots at 30,000 feet. Precipitation over spreading Kodiak. It's going to be increasing as it works its way northeastward. Heaviest, deepest moisture has yet to arrive up along the northern Gulf Coast in the vicinity and areas surrounding Prince William Sound. There's the low pressure. That low is actually going to be pulled back toward the southeast bearing, toward the north-northwest, and actually move inland into the southwest interior later Thursday and Friday. The frontal system, warm front, is going to lift north across the northern Gulf. That is going to facilitate the heavy rainfall along the northern Gulf Coast. That's the east side of the Kenai and up areas surrounding Prince William Sound. Several inches of rain will fall. Later tonight and into early Thursday morning, we'll see the heavier rain there across the eastern Kenai and developing through Prince William Sound as the low kind of pulls back there in the Bristol Bay toward the lower Kuskokwim basin there, and there it is by Thursday afternoon. The low will be situated pulling into the southwest interior with the frontal system working its way slowly east. That frontal system will help create some stronger, gustier winds across the Alaska range, and then by Friday, frontal system works its way eastward toward far southwestern Yukon and a weakening area of low pressure across the Seward Peninsula then. So this pattern is just going to continue one system after another every other day or so. Thursday morning, lows around or a bit above 50 in the Panhandle, generally 40s to near 50 across south central areas. Temperatures will be kept down, with the exception in the far southern Panhandle, some lower 60s, but back to the west in the clouds and rain and wind. Lower 50s at best, 40s and 50s, especially in the back country. When you get out away from, say, Anchorage and up there around Talkeetna and Glen Allen. Friday morning lows generally 40s there through south central areas with lows near or just above 50 there in the Panhandle. And again, Friday afternoon could see some temperatures in the 60s across the southern Panhandle, but elsewhere 40s and 50s. Across the far north, 30s along the Arctic coast, lower 40s in the interior, and maybe 60 there at Fort Yukon, otherwise 50s along the Yukon River, including Fairbanks, but otherwise 40s fairly common. And again, low temperatures Friday morning generally from the mid-30s to mid-40s, and temperatures confined to lower mid-50s up through the Yukon Valley, 40s elsewhere. And across the interior southwest, lows in the 40s, extending out there mid-40s in through the Aleutians. Generally high temperatures, only lower mid-50s across the southwest and the Alaska Peninsula. On Thursday afternoon, with lows again generally in the lower mid-40s in the interior, mid-40s across the Aleutians. And temperatures on Friday, hard-pressed to get much above 50 there through the lower Yukon basin, as well as the Kuskokwim, with highs at best mid-50s, say at Dillingham and around King Salmon. So here's the extended temperature outlook, 6 to 10 days, September 13th through the 17th, centered on the middle of September. Above normal temperatures, much of the state, especially centered there on west central areas. Otherwise, near normal in the southern Panhandle and the Aleutians, but above normal precipitation across much of the mainland, especially the southwest in through the central interior, as a result of continued southwesterly flow aloft off the Bering and North Pacific, feeding these weather systems. So it's going to stay wet across much of the mainland, maybe slightly drier, a little below normal precipitation anticipated for the southern half of the Panhandle.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Well, let's take a look at your aviation weather if you have a flight planned either Thursday or on Friday. Most important weather story is low pressure crossing today, Wednesday, across the Alaska Peninsula up into the southeast Bering, heading up toward Kuskokwim Bay. Then that's eventually going to push through the southwest interior, lower Yukon basin. As a result, strong frontal system. This is an early fall-like storm, but a strong frontal system working its way eastward across the western and northern Gulf is going to have some very strong southwesterly winds aloft that are going to bring an atmospheric river and heavier rainfall to areas around Prince William Sound, the eastern Kenai, but it's also going to bring some strong winds, southeasterly winds along and south of the Alaska range that are going to create moderate to isolated severe turbulence. Widespread IFR conditions there, northern western Gulf, back along the southwest coast for Thursday morning. Thursday afternoon, continued IFR along the Gulf Coast, especially areas around Yakutat westward through Prince William Sound, Kodiak Island, all the southwest coast pushing into some of the southwest interior, as well as the North Slope and along the Arctic coast. Friday morning, more widespread IFR conditions there in the far north along the Arctic coast, Brooks Range, North Slope, extending down to much of the southwest and south central interior, including the Kenai Peninsula and Prince William Sound eastward to just east of Yakutat. And Friday afternoon, you could even see an isolated thunderstorm pop up there, areas of the western Yukon Flats and the middle upper Tanana Valley. Otherwise, widespread MVFR conditions anticipated across south central areas, with IFR still along the central Yukon River north across the Brooks Range into the North Slope and along the Arctic coast, as well as back through the Bering Strait and into the southwest lower Yukon Delta. And at Tuvik Pass Thursday, you'll see IFR conditions become VFR. That's being a bit hopeful. At very least, maybe MVFR. Same thing at Adigan Pass IFR in the morning, trying to improve to VFR. Lake Clark and Merrill socked in with IFR conditions. Also there along the Alaska Range, the enhancement of turbulent flow, moderate turbulence likely. Rainy Pass IFR conditions with turbulence in place, potentially moderate to isolated severe turbulence. Windy Pass IFR conditions, heavier rainfalls there through the Mat-Su Valley on the south side of the Alaska Range with IFR conditions and moderate to isolated severe turbulence. Isabel, MVFR conditions with moderate turbulence expected, perhaps even some isolated severe turbulence. Same thing with Tasta Pass eastward, though maybe not quite as strong there as the frontal system has yet to work that far east. VFR becoming MVFR. Tanita Pass, MVFR, becoming IFR, and then down there in Portage, expect locally heavy rainfall. IFR conditions, especially the eastern half of the pass through Prince William Sound. The west entrance, MVFR conditions, and then Chilkoot and White in the far northern panhandle, look for MVFR conditions on Thursday. Freezing levels are highest out over the Gulf, bumping up to 8,000 and 10,000 feet ahead of the frontal system that's working its way eastward across south central areas on Thursday. Lowest freezing levels below 4,000 feet extend from around St. Lawrence Island, Nunavik Island, St. Matthew, down through the Pribilof Islands into the central and eastern Aleutians. Greatest threat for icing across the southwest and south central areas. Above 7,000 feet for the southwest interior. Above 9,000 feet along the northwestern Gulf Coast, and above 11,000 feet south there and east of Kodiak Island. Upper level jet stream winds 150 knots, southwesterly wind max southwest there of Kodiak Island. And yet another 100 plus to 120 knot jet max way off on the left side of the screen, coming in off of coastal Japan and the Kamchatka Peninsula. And then at 9,000 feet, we see winds upwards of 50 to 80 knots, southwesterly flow ahead of the frontal system up through the western Gulf into Prince William Sound, with strong winds upwards of 50 knots across the Alaska Range. That's at 9,000 or 700 millibars. Bring it down to 3,000 feet. Those winds will be lifting northward, but out over the Gulf, western Gulf, 45 to 55 knot southwesterly winds, a broad area of 40 to 45 knot winds from the Alaska Peninsula west into the western Aleutians. This translates to widespread, considerable moderate turbulence. There could be areas of isolated severe turbulence around the Alaska Range, surface to 10,000 feet, falling off to surface to 6,000 feet there, lower Cook Inlet, and then surface to 4,000 feet across the Alaska Peninsula.
Welcome back to another edition of Alaska Weather Facts. I'm meteorologist Dave Snyder. As you well know, you can get forecast information for any day of the week. Today, tonight, tomorrow, out to 6 or 7 days. It includes the high and low temperature, the wind direction, the chance of rain or snow in your part of Alaska. But did you know that there is information available to forecast out to 2 weeks? So the question is, how would you use that information? And here to answer that question today and tell us a lot more about climate services from the U.S. National Weather Service Alaska region is Rick Toman. He's the program manager for the Climate Science and Services. And Rick, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Dave.
How would we use information that is out to 2 weeks instead of just the high and low and the chance of rain?
Well, Dave, as we move out in time, of course, forecasts become more uncertain. So as we move into that second week from now, we're not looking at specific highs or lows or precipitation amounts at any given place. What we can do with the state of the science at this point is get a handle on patterns. So we can say things like increased chances for stormy weather in the Bering Sea in 2 weeks, or we've been in a cold weather pattern, looks like 8 to 10 days from now, that pattern's going to change. Those are the kind of forecasts that we can currently make in that second week.
So you're increasing lead time for perhaps big or small weather events and telling us the likelihood of maybe more coastal storms or wind events in some areas?
Those are the kinds of things that we hope to be able to let Alaskans know in the second week forecast. And if you have an activity or an event that you would find that kind of advance notice useful, whether it's moving stuff off of the beach, whether to go out hunting or to come back from camp, those kind of decisions, the week 2 provides the opportunity for you to get a handle on that kind of information.
Okay. What other type of weather impacts that we're familiar with might Alaskans use climate services for?
Well, in the forecast realm, we can go provide some information from this week 2, say the 8 to 14 day period, on out to the monthly and even seasonal time scale. Now, those monthly seasonal forecasts are still kind of just really very much pattern dependent, and the amount of detail that we can provide at this point is still pretty limited. Generally, indications of how temperature and precipitation will fall in maybe above normal, below normal kind of range. But in the week 2 period, we can be considerably more specific than that as far as the general patterns and really the impacts on Alaskans.
Okay, so we would be talking about generalizations there that would tell us that the period might be more stormy, might be more hot, more dry, more cold, and situations like that.
That's correct. So we're not going to be able to say in which community, for instance, there's the threat of coastal flooding, but we can often be able to tell we're moving into a pattern that would be conducive to big Bering Sea storms. So if you're in an area that could potentially impact you, you'll want to pay attention to the weather forecast.
Okay. Now, every day and every hour of the day, the National Weather Service is working on a forecast for the next day. But how do you start your forecast process for that extended period that goes out beyond 7 days?
Well, the way things work right now, we start off with the expected general flow pattern for Alaska and the whole world, really, and then we narrow that down to Alaska. So we start off with the basic computer model forecast. There's quite a few different computer models that we look at, bring those together. And then another important part of that is we attempt to assess the confidence. The reality is often 2 weeks away, the computer models are very divergent. They have lots of different solutions, and that's an indication that we don't have much confidence. But when we see more agreement in that time frame, and when that agreement is a pattern that will be potentially very impactful for Alaska or is a big change from what we've been in, that's when we can then take that expected pattern. We have computer models forecasting it. We've assessed the confidence. Now we can move that forward. How, using our experience as Alaskan weather forecasters, how does that typically play out for Alaska? So is this a stormy pattern for the Bering Sea? Is this an extra rainy period for Southeast? Is this the kind of pattern that generates strong winds potentially in the Anchorage Bowl? Is this a deep cold pattern for the interior? All of those are the kind of things that we're looking at in these large-scale patterns. That's very different than telling you that the winds on 10 days from now are going to be gusting to 120 on the hillside. We're looking for patterns, not the very specific information that the Weather Service will then hone in on as the event gets closer.
So the idea is to keep the 5, 6, 7 day forecast the same, where you are getting the standard high and low temperature and the chance of wind or rain, but further out you get a broad general forecast, but as the time gets closer to that event, we'll get a lot more specific.
That's correct.
Okay, very good. So how can people use this information if I am out in the bush and I want to see, is a coastal storm expected in my region, or is a chance for that improving over the next 2 to 3 weeks? Where could I go to get information like that?
When we see that potentially impactful or a big change in the weather is coming 8 to 14 days out, typically we will start to highlight that on the Weather Service Facebook site. We might produce a YouTube video highlighting that, linking that on our Facebook site. So often we don't, at this point, we don't have much to say in that because we're really looking for those forecasts of opportunities. But one thing we can say very likely as we go through the next 2 or 3 years, there'll be more and more of this kind of forecast information available in that week 2 time frame.
Okay, and something that emergency managers and city planners and folks in villages might be interested in keeping an eye out for, looking for that information to be headlined, whether that's on social media or perhaps through the National Weather Service channels there to get information from you to make better plans a little bit longer term and make better preparations in the event that things become a little bit more unsettled.
Absolutely. Climate Services with the National Weather Service Alaska region is talking to the state of Alaska every week, apprising them of that 2-week outlook. And on the social media side, we are working to keep Alaskans informed so that when we think we have some confidence in a high impact or a big change, that's the best way right now for folks to find out about that. Twitter, Facebook, so stay tuned to your National Weather Service.
Very good, a developing program. Rick Toman with the National Weather Service Alaska region. He's a Climate Science and Services Program Manager. Thanks so much for joining us again, Rick, and I hope to have you back again soon.
Great, thanks Dave.
For another edition of Alaska Weather Facts, I'm meteorologist Dave Snyder. We'll see you next time.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Welcome back to the marine weather segment. Before we get to the marine forecast, let's look at the sea ice edge quickly. Really essentially no ice left along at least the coastal areas of Alaska for at least some ice-free navigation here in late summer and the very beginning of the early fall season. And then we would expect that at this point in time. Look for winds, though, to be increasing, especially along the Arctic coast by Friday as the pressure gradient tightens as a result of a frontal system lifting further north out of the mainland and bumping up against the high pressure way up there in the Arctic Ocean. But across the southeast panhandle on Thursday, northwest winds 10 knots, 2-foot waves around Ketchikan, Metlakatla, but winds southeast to south 20-25 knots with gusts to 35 knots, the middle channels, and waves 4 to 5 feet. Outer coast, southwest winds generally 15 to 20 knots, but increasing to gale force well west of Yakutat to near Cordova, where waves along the outer coast generally running 5-6 feet by Friday. Inner channels 15 knot southeast winds, 3-foot waves Ketchikan, Metlakatla, but however some gust of 35 to 40 knots possible. The middle channels on up through Lynn Canal with waves of 4 to 5 feet. The outer coast winds generally keeping some southwesterly direction around 20 knots, though a bit stronger, 25 knots Yakutat westward. Waves running anywhere from 9 feet off of Craig to as high as 12 to 15 feet north and west of Gustavus. The western and northern Gulf is where the action will be. Strong frontal system with strong winds. We have southeasterly gales to 40 knots, Prince William Sound and south of Cordova there in the open waters of the Gulf. Waves 9 feet in Prince William Sound and running anywhere from around 12 to 15 feet in the open waters of the Gulf off of the Kenai. South winds to 30 knots at the entrance there of Cook Inlet with waves of 10 to 15 feet. And northeasterly winds to 30 knots there mid and upper Cook Inlet with waves running around 8 to 9 feet. And then on Friday, winds are going to become more or less south-southwesterly to 30 knots off the Kenai in the open waters of the Gulf, as well as the entrance of Cook Inlet and up through Middle Cook Inlet with waves running generally 10 to 15 feet off the Kenai, 9 to 12 feet there at the entrance of Cook Inlet. And across Kodiak Island and the Alaska Peninsula, winds will generally be southwest at 25 to 30 knots on Thursday. Waves as high as 15, 17 feet there east of Kodiak Island, and generally 6 feet Bristol Bay back to north of Cold Bay. On Friday, look for general southwest winds across the region, 30 to 35 knots, waves running 10 to as high as 15 feet on the North Pacific and Gulf side, and generally 10 to 11 feet Bristol Bay down toward Cold Bay on the Bering side. Thursday's winds across the eastern and central Aleutians will be west to northwest, generally around 25 knots, waves 6 to 8 feet to the North Pacific side and around 8 feet on the Bering side. Friday's winds will be fairly uniform across the Aleutian chain, southwesterly to 30 knots, waves 9-10 feet on the North Pacific side and 9 to 12 feet on the Bering side. Low pressure will be crossing up through Kuskokwim Bay to near Bethel Thursday afternoon, and the circulation around it will have northeast winds out of Norton Sound, 25 knots, waves 5 feet there, turning northerly, and then northwesterly once you get east of St. Paul and St. George with waves 6 to 8 feet there. And for Friday, northwest winds out of Norton Sound and south of St. Lawrence, but still southwesterly south of Nunavik Island and west of St. Paul, or I should say east of St. Paul and St. George with waves of 8 to 9 feet. Along the Arctic coast, easterly winds 10 to 15 knots on Thursday, waves running a few feet. Turning northeasterly at 10 to 15 knots through the lower Chukchi Sea with waves at 2 to 3 feet, increasing to 20 knots from the north on the north side of St. Lawrence with waves of 4 to 5 feet. And Friday, that gradient strengthens there along the Arctic coast, 30-knot easterly winds with waves 9 to 11 feet, turning northeasterly and then northerly through the lower Chukchi Sea around 25 knots before shifting to the northwest, south of the Bering Strait and on the north side of St. Lawrence Island with waves running 5 to 6 feet. Thursday afternoon, low pressure centered there in the southwest interior with heavier rainfall west and east of the Alaska Range. Heaviest rain centered around Prince William Sound, the eastern Kenai, especially toward Cordova. And strong gusty winds through the Alaska Range. Atmospheric river continue to feed the heavier rainfall, begins to break down on Friday with the pressure gradient increasing along the Arctic coast as that front in the interior presses a little further north.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.